Ladies and gentlemen, to make the history of the great conspiracy both clear and convincing, we need 100 volumes of 1,000 pages each. And we hope that those scholarly volumes will all be written in due course as a guide and a warning to future generations. But at present we have a more immediate and more urgent task. We want to give you simply an outline of the progress of this organized evil force from its beginning up to the present time. The aim of the conspirators always has been and still is to impose the brutal tyranny of their rule over the whole human race. Today, they are at last within striking distance of that ultimate goal. And we agree with the Honorable J. Edgar Hoover, who stated in the April 1961 FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin that the way to fight it, communism, is to study it, understand it, and discover what can be done about it. We think that the only way to stop the communists is to create sufficient understanding soon enough among enough people as to what is really taking place all around us. So let's do our best within the limits that are practicable for this occasion to review the whole fantastic story step by step. A, the early background. Step 1, we must hunt the first steps largely in the shadows rather than in the substance of history, for the conspiracy is deep-rooted. 200 years ago, or during the last half of the 18th century, there were in Europe many secret societies with grandiose dreams of overthrowing all existing human institutions and of rising out of the resulting chaos as the all-powerful rulers of a new order of civilization. Of these groups, the Illuminati, founded in Bavaria by Adam Weishaupt on May 1, 1776, was undoubtedly the most important. Step number 2. By 1789, the Illuminati were already strong enough to have had a great deal to do with planning and precipitating the Holocaust known as the French Revolution. In that upheaval, we find many elements of communist strategy and purpose with which we are familiar today. One was the ruthless undermining of rulers and governments in order to destroy them. Another was the destruction of all religion by substituting the worship of reason in its place. You will remember that the revolutionaries erected in Paris a statue to the goddess of reason as a symbol of this change. A third element was the fomenting by a few professional agitators of mob action made to appear as a spontaneous uprising of the people. A fourth was the massive use of terror to silence all opposition. A fifth was the use of the manufactured smear to destroy the enemies of the revolution or its temporary leaders. And all of these objectives and methods, which sound like rehearsals for what is happening throughout the world today, had either been specifically set forth by Weishaupt for his Order of Illuminati or were the practical applications of his program. 3. By 1795, the French Revolution had run its horrible course, and there was a gradual return even in France to traditional beliefs, values, and institutions. Although it led to the Napoleonic Wars, which for the next 20 years devastated so much of Europe, this revolutionary fire in France had failed to set off a continent-wide social conflagration as the Illuminati and similar groups had hoped and planned. And henceforth the Illuminati observed even more closely than before the original Weishaupt instruction that the very existence of the order should be denied and kept secret at all costs. But the fact that the Illuminati were active at the end of the 18th century with a growing reach and influence in many countries is clearly proved in the detailed histories of Robison and the Abbé Barruel. And the short-lived Babeuf conspiracy reveals that other groups though possibly allied or subsidiary to the Illuminati, were working for the same totally destructive purposes. 4. During the 19th century, some of these secret societies and subversive groups appear to have grown and coalesced into the communist conspiracy as we know it today. However hidden the controlling nerve centers may have been, by 1848, some of the activities and even organizational structures of the conspiracy were becoming visible. The first important declaration of purposes, using the name of communism as we understand the word today, was issued by Karl Marx in 1848. Communist plotting was at work to some extent in the numerous uprisings of that year, 1848, as it has been in almost all insurrections and wars involving European nations since that time. 5. But the communist movement is only a tool of the total conspiracy. As secret as the communist activities and organizations generally appear, they are part of an open book compared to the secrecy enveloping some higher degree of this diabolic force. The extrinsic evidence is strong and convincing that by the beginning of the 20th century, there had evolved an inner core of conspiratorial power able to direct and control subversive activities which were worldwide in their reach, incredibly cunning and ruthless in their nature, and brilliantly far-sighted and patient in their strategy. Whether or not this increasingly all-powerful hidden command was due to an unbroken continuation of Weishaupt's Illuminati, or was a distillation from the leadership of this and other groups, we do not know. Some of them may never have been communists, while others were. To avoid as much dispute as possible, therefore, let's call this ruling clique simply the insiders. But we do need some such term for both clarity and convenience. And it should be recognized that always pushing and promoting each other into higher positions on every road to power and wealth and fame has been a vital part of the strategy of this fraternity from the beginning, and of the motivation of its members at any given time. The goal for each generation of conspirators, the tie that bound them together, lay in what this self-perpetuating body was to become, but the contemporary reward and satisfaction was in the becoming. 6. For more than 100 years now, the conspiracy had pushed on steadily along many avenues, all leading to the one goal of world rule. During the last half of the 19th century, the insiders were using the communists, the anarchists, the socialists of various hues and kinds, and dozens of other groups to promote their purposes. Many of these groups were largely unconscious of how they were being spurred on and guided by a few clever insiders. While under the guise of humanitarianism and in the pretended promotion of freedom and equality and brotherhood, these insiders and the gullible idealists who served as their dupes were busily undermining the very beliefs and institutions which made the 19th century a high watermark of such civilization as man has laboriously achieved. One broad avenue down which these conspiratorial forces advanced was known as progressive legislation. The very same collectivist theories and demagogic pretenses which had destroyed earlier civilizations were now paraded forth in the disguise of new and modern concepts. What Pisistratus had done in Athens in the 6th century BC, with the leverage of his vaunted concern for the working classes, Bismarck now began in Germany by basically the same approach. The controls which Diocletian had imposed on the Roman people 1,600 years before entirely for the good of the people themselves, you understand, were now matched by one socialistic regime in France after another. And in England, the advance of government paternalism caused Herbert Spencer to comment that the ultimate result of protecting fools from their own folly must be to fill the planet full of fools. Now, this great and growing stream of socialistic legislation was made possible, of course, by idealists with only the noblest of intentions, combined with or led by venal politicians with no more nefarious objectives than glory and pelf for themselves. In the rotting French Republic of 1900 AD, as in the rotting Roman Empire of 300 AD, most of the rot was introduced in the name of progress. Most of the people of Europe and America, for the past 100 years, for instance, have gradually been led to believe fervently that everything in the way of security legislation, from the first Workmen's Compensation Acts under Bismarck to the latest Medicare monstrosity under Lyndon Johnson, was a proof of their own nobility of outlook. And this is not the place to go into any discussion as to which pieces of the mosaic may really have been justified and worthwhile. For unrecognized by the visionary do-gooders and even by the opportunistic politicians, who alike were inveigled into pushing along this new humanitarianism, was the constant thread of its hidden purpose. That actual purpose was, on the part of the instigators who contrived it, always and by all means to reduce the responsibilities and rights of individual citizens while steadily increasing the quantity, the reach, and the potential tyranny of governments. This was the real long-range goal of the insiders who designed and controlled the movement, but who had realized from the beginning that communism must largely be advanced by non-communists who know not what they are doing. In the United States, with its remaining pioneer spirit and ubiquitous opportunities, the season was not yet ripe for offering this mess of pottage. And timing is always an essential part of communist strategy. But there was still plenty that could be done as a part of the grand design. So by 1914, the insiders, with comparatively few agents, but tremendous influence and cunning, had already brought about in our own country such decisively important measures in their program as central banking, a graduated personal income tax, and the direct election of senators. The brilliantly contrived central banking apparatus was called the Federal Reserve System. As in the case of the graduated income tax, its long-range significance and use could be well hidden under the pretended objectives at the time of its founding. And its ultimate value to the conspirators could be tremendously enhanced by the character and ability of the good men drawn into its top positions during the early decades of its existence. But what this function and prestige of the Federal Reserve System would inevitably come to mean, in time and in actual practice, was the control of credit, the control of the money supply, the ability to spend with increasing profligacy, and the means to steal continuously from the people by the debasement of our currency on the part of the federal government. And we have reached the stage today where all of these results have visibly come to pass. The graduated income tax, of course, was the second plank in Karl Marx's program for imposing communism on any country. From the very beginning, the whole scheme included, without the knowledge or understanding of the American people, a parallel gimmick for the benefit of the insiders, which we can identify as the system of tax-exempt foundations. The actual result of this development has been, as it was intended to be, that the wealthiest men in America have been able to accumulate untold billions of liquid wealth in these foundations by escaping the increasingly confiscatory taxes which prevented such accumulations outside of the foundation formula, and still have practically as much control of what can be done with this money and how it shall be spent in helping to move our country leftward as if these billions were in their private bank accounts. Since the founding of the Illuminati, each generation of insiders has visibly followed, so far as they were able, Weishaupt's stated and aggressive policy of pulling within their conspiratorial circle the sons of the very powerful and the very rich. In the United States, this policy, combined with the income tax squeeze on one side and the foundation loophole on the other, has gradually brought fantastic wealth into the service of the conspiracy, while putting ever greater handicaps and stronger brakes on the acquisition or the uses of money by those who might oppose the plans of the insiders. And the direct election of senators was of tremendously more importance than was realized when the 17th Amendment was adopted in 1913. For as long as the senators for any state had been elected by the legislature of that state, they clearly represented the state itself as a sovereign entity within a federal union, and not just the citizens of the United States within certain boundaries, as was the case for the members of the House of Representatives. This distinction had been carefully planned by our founding fathers in their studied effort to extend and improve upon what Cicero had praised so highly as the diffusion of government in the early Roman Republic. We had a division of federal governmental power into three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. We had the grand division between federal power and governmental power retained by the states. And we had the further division of this state power, again between three branches. The insiders, however, wanted gradually and eventually to bring about a concentration of all governmental power into the hands of the executive department of one central government. And the direct election of senators was actually their first huge legalistic step in that direction. Number 7. It was during this period, too, that the insiders learned to foment, nourish, magnify, and utilize every natural division among men, whether based on race, color, language, or religion, to create strife ranging from a precinct political feud to a major war between nations, to stimulate and control both sides of all such bitter divisions among mankind, and to profit enormously from the opportunities thus offered them to grasp more power amid the resulting chaos, resignation, and despair. Today, the most important basic split among mankind lies in color. The communists are making the greatest possible capital for themselves out of that division, and are planning to make even more capital in the future. But in the 19th century, the division of greatest significance was between Jew and Gentile. So the most valuable plank in this area of communist strategy was the revival, nourishment, and magnification of the dislike, distrust, and bitterness now associated with the term anti-Semitism. The communists are always sharpening and using both edges of this sword. In their efforts to weaken and destroy the John Birch Society, just for an illustration, they have dupes and agents clamoring incessantly that the society is anti-Semitic. And at the very same time, they have agents provocateurs everywhere trying to persuade members of the society that the whole communist movement is simply a Jewish conspiracy, and that these members are wasting their time in the John Birch Society because its leaders do not have the courage to name the enemy. And by this typical communist method, they have made anti-Semitism into one of the most powerful weapons in their whole arsenal of destruction. Number 8, but the decisive success of the insiders and of the various groups and forces through which they have worked in this more shadowy period of their machinations and advance prior to 1917 lay in their instigation of the First World War. Looking back now, it is easy to see how this great beginning of the long, deliberate destruction of the soundest values and most stable institutions of our civilization, at the cost of the cruel killing of so many of the finest youth of Europe and America, was deliberately contrived by power-hungry criminal megalomaniacs in this clique of insiders simply to serve their own purposes. The very slogan, "To make the world safe for democracy," by which Americans were inspired to greater enthusiasm in their contribution to this Holocaust, should have been a giveaway to any intelligent student of history and political science. For at least since the time of the Greeks, it has been well known, as it clearly was to our founding fathers, that democracy was not only the worst of all forms of government, but was the last direct step of any nation and any people on the road to an unbridled mobocratic dictatorship. By 1916, it was already so important to the insiders to convert our constitutional republic into a democracy that Edward Mandell House and his dupes and allies even used their war, in part, to promote the proper attitude for such a change on the part of the American people. But this was only a comparatively small part of the mighty betrayal, not only of the United States, but of our whole human race and of its reasonably humane civilization. For once America had been enticed by lying propaganda and tremendous cunning into this great senseless European war, the world could never be the same again, nor as happy and sane a world again for at least a long, long time, as the insiders were well aware, and they undoubtedly rejoiced at the success of their satanic schemes. Section B, From War to War. Step number 9. This brings us out of the shadows into the historically clear past with regard to the steps we are listing in the progress of the conspirators. For in 1917, Lenin, Trotsky, and a relative handful of ruthless criminals, financed and directed by insiders in various European countries and in the United States, seized power in Russia. Communism, from being solely a tenuous, invisible net of influence, intrigue, and undercover activity, materialized into a palpable, visible force with a working headquarters on solid ground. Since that time, the communist arm of the conspiracy has come to be regarded, however inaccurately, as its whole body. And while there undoubtedly still are insiders aiding and directing and controlling worldwide communist activities and benefiting from communist progress without themselves ever having carried a communist card or belonged to the Communist Party, their own power will now rise or fall with the power of their agency and front called communism. For practical considerations, the agency has become almost the equivalent of the principle. The enemy which we need to oppose, expose, and destroy in order to save our country and our civilization can properly be identified as the communist conspiracy. But to understand this enemy, it is important to remember and to understand its roots. Number 10. After 1917, the communists quickly and ruthlessly solidified their first physical conquests. In 1922, after unlimited use of terror and torture in establishing their tyranny, this communist gang led by Lenin consolidated Russia proper, Russian Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, and the Ukraine into the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. It is worth remembering, however, that the USSR was founded in 1922, not 1917. Number 11. After Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin gradually took his place and then rose far above it. By 1929, Stalin had succeeded in exiling Trotsky from Russia and in making himself the recognized dictator. Then, through merciless massacres in the Ukraine and elsewhere, and later through a ruthless purge of most of his old fellow revolutionaries, Stalin made himself the absolute boss of the Russia-based communist operation. What his relationship finally became to any hierarchy of insiders, of which Lenin, for instance, had visibly been merely an agent, we have no way of even guessing with assurance. But for the practical purposes of our brief history, we can consider Stalin as having been supreme in the communist world from 1939 until his death in 1953. Number 12. In 1933, 16 years after the communists had seized power in Russia, they achieved their next tremendous victory. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, officially recognized the Soviet regime, thus saving it from impending financial collapse and at the same time opening our doors to an ever-increasing army of communist diplomats, agents, and spies. Even more important, this step marked the beginning of the alliance between Washington and Moscow, which has steadily grown stronger ever since, despite some occasional and transparent pretenses to the contrary. Number 13. Stalin's next great success was in bringing on World War II. Through the Sorge spy ring and other vast diplomatic espionage and propaganda activities, he had engaged in long and extensive plans for plunging the world into another war. There is no doubt that he had plenty of help in this endeavor from insiders within the governments and occupying other positions of great influence in most of the important nations involved. By 1939, all of this planning was ready for fruition. Stalin then precipitated the war by encouraging Hitler, through a temporary alliance, to invade Poland. Number 14. By the end of 1941, Stalin had exactly the alignment he had wanted. He had broken with his carefully built-up foil, Adolf Hitler, who had then invaded both France and Russia itself. The United States had been brought into the war in Europe by massive propaganda, with the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor as the blinding flash which overcame all resistance to our involvement. The alliance of the Western capitals with Moscow, already largely in effect through the work of Stalin's agents and the influence of the insiders, now became official. The Western powers not only blindly accepted Stalin as an ally, but then conducted the war largely according to his dictation, in a manner to serve his purposes. Hypocrisy and propaganda reigned supreme, with treason in the background behind them. Although the officially stated purpose of the whole war in Europe was to protect the territorial integrity of Poland and other small nations, it was never even suggested that Stalin give up that part of Poland which he had seized in his joint crime with Hitler. Nor were the American people allowed to grasp the fact that Soviet Russia remained practically an ally of our enemy, Japan, through the Molotov-Matsuoka non-aggression pact during all the years we were supporting Stalin so mightily in the war with Germany. Nor were the American people allowed to realize the further fact that Stalin's agent, Mao Zedong, was keeping huge armies of our real ally, Chiang Kai-shek, tied up in preventing Mao's communist forces from overrunning all of the northern provinces of China, right while Chiang's armies were so badly needed to fight Japan, the joint enemy of both China and ourselves. And it was kept especially well hidden from the American people that Stalin, by cruel trickery, managed to keep our war with Japan going for many months after the Japanese were trying desperately to surrender. Everything about this war, in Asia as in Europe, was grist for the communist mill, and the killing and destruction on so vast a scale did not cause Stalin nor the insiders any more compunction than if they had overturned an ant heap.